Hi, and welcome to today's webinar. We're so happy that you can join us. My name is Leslie, and just want to welcome everybody that's joining us near and far. We have lots of people that have signed up for this webinar, so I know the topic is of great interest to everyone. So as I said, my name is Leslie. I help those who love Purdue stay connected, get involved, and give back. So the Purdue for Life Foundation was just established in 2020 as a cornerstone for connecting alumni, fans, and friends. Before I introduce our speaker this afternoon, what I would like to do is share a short video that will share more about the Purdue for Life Foundation and our work here.
Stay connected, get involved, give back. We help people who love Purdue do just that. The Purdue for Life Foundation was created in 2020 by uniting the Purdue Alumni Association and the University Development Office. We're here to serve and advance Purdue, working across the West Lafayette campus and far beyond it. At a high level, Purdue for Life includes the Purdue Alumni Association, President's Council, John Purdue Club, and the brand new Parents and Families Club. We also encompass Purdue Foundation Student Board and Purdue Alumni Student Experience, or PACE, the largest student organization on campus. We connect Boilermakers throughout the world to the university through region and interest-based clubs and networks. In fact, we have more than 70 alumni clubs around the country, international alumni networks in more than 100 cities across the globe, and multiple affinity networks, including Purdue Black Alumni Organization and Purdue Women's Network. And we're just getting started. What does it all mean for you? One organization is now driving and coordinating all alumni, friend, and fan-related activities, and offering you even more ways to engage with the university you love across your lifetime. We're streamlining communications and making our flagship digital magazine, Purdue Alumnus, available to all Boilermakers. We're offering a wealth of new and expanded opportunities for you to stay connected and get involved through alumni living and through lifelong learning, volunteerism, travel, and recent graduate programs. And you don't want to miss our signature events. There are countless opportunities for those who love Purdue to make an impact through giving their time, talent, and treasure. And what an impact you made during the fiscal year that just ended. The collective generosity of our Purdue family reached an all-time high. Talk about a giant leap. You are powering Purdue. Thanks to you, Purdue continues to strengthen its reputation in teaching and research while remaining affordable and accessible to brilliant young minds. And because of you, Purdue is stronger than ever. Together, through small steps and giant leaps, we can grant even more opportunities for future Boilermakers as we ensure Purdue grows ever stronger.
It's our privilege at Purdue for Life and our persistent pursuit to help people who love Purdue stay connected, get involved, and give back. On behalf of our team, thank you and Boiler Up.
I would like to go ahead and introduce and thank Zach Westerbeck. He's our speaker today, and I've known Zach a while now, and we've been talking about what a workshop like this could look like. And based on the number of people that signed up, we just had an excellent turnout, and I know that this is a topic that really, really resonates with many of our alumni fans and friends. So with that being said, I'm going to introduce Zach. Zach is a 2014 Purdue graduate. These days, Zach is a mental health advocate, national speaker, college success coach, and author of You're Not Alone, a book that addresses anxiety and depression. Zach was diagnosed with an anxiety disorder in 2016. After hitting his rock bottom moment, he sought help and started his recovery. Through his recovery process, he became certified in mental health first aid and now travels the country, educating thousands of students on the fundamentals of mental health. Real quickly, just a few housekeeping items. I want to remind you that your microphones are muted, so today's presentation, if you have questions, you can enter those in the chat feature, and we'll answer as many of those as we can after Zach's remarks today. And with that being said, I now present Zach. Welcome, Zach.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Leslie. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. A big shout out to the Purdue for Life Foundation. And Leslie, thank you so much for having me on today. I'm so excited to see that we have over 240 people on today to talk about what I believe is one of the most important topics that we can be thinking about today and into the future with ourselves, but especially with our children as well. And so as we kick off this workshop, I want to ask what I believe is one of the most important questions we can think about. And I always pose this to the thousands of students that I speak to on an annual basis. And that is, why should you care about mental health? Why should you care? And the reason why I ask this question, and the reason why I speak to college students and ask them this question, is because when I was their age, I don't know if I would have had a good answer. At that time, none of my friends were openly talking about their mental health. From a societal level, people weren't really discussing their mental health, and I myself wasn't struggling with any mental health challenges. And yet, what I've learned from my own personal experience, I just got a message that's saying no audio. Can other people hear me? Okay, all right, okay, perfect. And yet what I've learned from my own personal experience and then my advocacy work speaking to thousands of students across the country is that we all have mental health, and therefore it's something that we all need to care about. And I'm so bold in this statement that I will tell you there are three types of people on this Zoom today. The first group is those of us that are struggling with some sort of mental health challenge right now. Could be stress, overwhelm, burnout, anxiety, depression, or even thoughts of suicide. That's group number one. Group number two is those of us that at some point in our lifetime could experience some of those symptoms. Same applies for our children. Again, stress, overwhelm, burnout, anxiety, depression, or thoughts of suicide. And the third group is those of us that are going to know somebody, again, maybe a loved one, maybe one of our children, who is struggling with some sort of a mental health challenge. And we're going to need to be able to give them the support that they need to get on their path to recovery. For me, as an advocate, as somebody with a lived experience, I fall into all three categories. I'm curious where you sort of see yourself falling into the three buckets as we kick off today's workshop. Now, maybe you are somebody, I know everyone here is a Purdue grad, so I'm sure a lot of you are math-minded individuals being in engineering school, and I'm sure that you're curious about the statistics. When we think about our children's mental health and the proliferation of it across society. Well, the CDC, or the Center for Disease Control, released a report that said that in any given year, 1/4 of Americans, 25% of Americans over the age of 18 are going to experience some form of anxiety or depression. And I see this at every university and high school that I speak at. And over the course of a lifetime, the CDC estimates that that number doubles to 50%, that over 88 million Americans over the age of 18 are going to experience some form of anxiety or depression in their lifetime. From a teenage standpoint, the National Survey of Children's Health released a report, and they found that 7% of students reported an anxiety disorder, 15% reported a major depressive episode, 36% reported that they had persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness, and sadly, 19% seriously considered attempting suicide. From a collegiate standpoint, from a young adult standpoint, the American College Health Association released a report, and they found that in a 12-month time period, 55% of college students reported feeling things were hopeless, 88% reported feeling overwhelmed by all that they had to do, 82% reported feeling exhausted, and not from physical activity, but mental fatigue. 42% reported that depression significantly impacted their ability to function, and 50% of college students said that anxiety significantly impacted their ability to complete their schoolwork, making anxiety the most common symptom amongst college students. I can absolutely attest to that when I go and speak to students across the country, anxiety seems to be everywhere. And suicide is the second leading cause of death amongst college students. And this is exactly why I advocate and why I speak to parents and college students and teenagers alike, because of my own personal experience. Like everybody on this call, I graduated from Purdue University. Like Leslie said, I graduated in 2014. While I was at Purdue, I was a part of the Greek community, and I graduated from the Krannert School of Business with a degree in economics. So I thought I was going to go down the path of business. That was my initial vision for my life. And when I graduated, I moved from Indianapolis, Indiana, down to Raleigh, North Carolina, to start my career working for the technology company Cisco Systems. So I thought I was going to be in this innovative, fast-paced environment, and that was going to be my life. And for the first 10 months of my career, everything was great. But then right at around the 10-month mark, things started to change with the way that my brain functioned. And all of a sudden, I was waking up with sweaty palms, a dry mouth, racing thoughts, and a pounding heart. Now, I'm 22 years old. I'm a 10-hour drive from home. I know that I don't like what I'm feeling, but I also know that I don't know what I'm feeling, and I don't want anybody else to know what I'm going through. Common themes that I see amongst teens and young adults. And so in my mind, I devised a plan. I was going to take the first 31 days of January of 2016, and I was going to flip my brain back to the way that it used to be. And I was going to do this by going to work, going to the gym, and sitting in the steam room and sweating out all the toxins in my body. I just felt like I just need to do a little detox, a little reset. And so that's what I did. For 31 days, I went to work, to the gym, to the steam room religiously. And I did get results. The only challenge is that it wasn't the results that I was looking for. And by the end of the month, not only had the symptoms I told you all about get worse and intensify, that I now know was and is severe anxiety, but a second symptom had crept in, and that was depression. Now, I had never experienced depression before in my entire life, and I always tell the kids I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. Depression and anxiety combined together can be so crippling and debilitating. Now, I'm going to spare some of the details for the sake of time today, but within a couple more months, a third symptom had crept in, and that was thoughts of suicide. And now, from the moment I was waking up to the moment I went to bed, I was experiencing thoughts of suicide. Now, I wanted to live. I've always considered myself a positive, happy-go-lucky individual, but I eventually hit my rock bottom moment where I felt like suicide was my only option. In my mind, I had exhausted every option to improve my anxiety, to improve my depression, to get rid of the thoughts of suicide. And it felt like the harder I tried, the worse that they became. And so I eventually hit that rock bottom moment. But before taking any action, I decided that I would confide in my parents. And what they did for me that pivotal night when I called them is what I now do, traveling the country, speaking to teens, young adults, and parents about mental health. See, they encouraged me to go seek professional assistance. And in late 2016, I was diagnosed with a chronic brain disorder known as obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD, where the core symptoms are severe anxiety, deep depression, and thoughts of suicide. And so that I immediately started talk therapy specific to OCD. And over the course of the next couple of years, through talk therapy, lifestyle changes, and mindset shifts, I got back to a place where I wanted to advocate for others. I never wanted somebody else to suffer in silence, especially young adults and teens. And so I wrote this book, You're Not Alone, which is a guide for young adults to help them overcome anxiety and depression. And it's everything that I wish I would have known at the start of my journey. And as we start tonight's workshop off, I want every parent on this workshop to know two things as it pertains to their child. If your child right now is struggling with some form of anxiety, depression, some sort of mental health challenge, I want you to know that they're not alone. They're truly not. I didn't know this at the start of my journey, but there are millions of people in America and worldwide that struggle with these symptoms. And it doesn't make us weak, weird, or different. It makes us human. And I think that that's really, really important, that we know that we're not going at this journey alone. The second thing is that recovery is possible. When I was diagnosed with a chronic brain disorder, I thought my whole life was over. I thought my whole life was over and that I was never going to live a normal life again. And what I've learned through my journey is that that simply wasn't true. And we're going to talk about that a little more in depth. But no matter what you or one of your children is going through, recovery is possible. And I want you to know that. So as we kick off today's workshop, there are 3 key takeaways that I think are critically important for us to lay the foundation as we start to think about mental health today and into the future. The first thing that I want to do is I want to debunk and talk about some mental health myths and then reframe what it means to have mental health. Secondly, I want us to all learn to recognize the signs and symptoms of anxiety, depression, and suicide in real world terms so that we can be advocates for ourselves and our children. And then lastly, I want to teach all of you how to effectively communicate to promote help-seeking behavior and then foster what I like to call a brain health-centric culture inside of the household. Now, as we kick off today's workshop, and I want you to take this one with you so you can speak to your children about this afterwards, I'm going to be using the term brain health in replacement of the term mental health. And the reason why I do this is as a destigmatizing tool. The same way that we don't call our heart health soul health because it's a tangible organ in the body and there are actions that we can take to improve its functionality, is the exact same thing with our brains. And I always tell the kids this, and I feel like it really resonates with them. Our brains are a tangible organ in our body, and there are actions that we can take to improve its functionality and decrease symptoms of stress, burnout, anxiety, depression, and suicide. So I'll be using the term brain health moving forward. With that being said, I want to hear from all of you as parents, speaking to your children and with your own belief systems or what you've heard over the years. What are some of the perspectives that you've heard as it pertains to mental health and disorders? I'm going to pull some of the ones that I've heard from students. This is from thousands of students over the years when they initially think about and talk about brain health. And I always hear them say things like, it's for weak people, or you'll get over it in time, or that somewhere along the line, somebody told them to just try thinking happy thoughts, or just to push through, or that you just need to breathe, or it's all in your head, or it's just a phase. If there's anything else that you've heard over the years as a parent, as a loved one, and you want to put it in the chat, I'd love to hear from you. Of course, there's no pressure. Yes, Helen said redirect thoughts. Absolutely. Absolutely. Another one that I've heard from students as well. It's just a phase. So these are some of the belief systems that are floating out there amongst the youth, right? And we sort of, yeah, Sonia said it'll be okay, which in a lot of ways, I'm sure it comes across as trying to be encouraging, but at times can sort of downplay whatever your child or whatever that young adult is going through. Christy said, suck it up. Absolutely. Jennifer just needs to get out and socialize. Absolutely. Helen, CBT, use cognitive behavioral therapy. I like that. Now that's a little more of an evolved mentality. Angie, what can be so bad that you'd want to kill yourself? Huge, huge. And I had that belief system once upon a time. Yeah, Laura, what do you really have to be sad about? I had that belief system too. I remember in college, a pledge brother tried to approach me when he was feeling depressed. And I said that exact same thing to him because I didn't understand at that time. And what do we notice about all these sayings, right? Too hard or impossible to get the right help. Absolutely. That's a really big one, especially in today's day and age where maybe we're more open to the idea of it, but we sort of stigmatize it in the sense that, oh, well, nobody else can help me, right? I hear this from young adults all the time. What is somebody going to tell me that I don't already know about myself? And it's on us as parents and supporters to help them navigate those belief systems. And that's what I always tell the students. What do all of these phrases have in common? Well, they're all negative. And what I tell them is when you have a stigma towards something, that's nothing but a way of looking at something as negative or unfavorable. And there's really a cyclical nature towards this stigma that can be harmful. And I'll draw everybody's attention. This is for education purposes, because I really want to, as we're building a brain health centric culture inside of the household, I really want to start to shift away from as many harmful beliefs as possible. And the reason for that is what you can see on the top 4 bullet points, where first and foremost, when we allow the stigma to live inside of us and inside of our children, whenever they're feeling uncomfortable symptoms, just like I was, a lot of times there's this initial fear of judgment and impact to reputation. Now, this isn't necessarily for every child. Some children might be very familiar with therapy and be very comfortable, but others are not. And because of this fear of judgment and impact to reputation, oftentimes there's this huge reluctance to seek professional health care. And I see this all the time on college campuses, where they know that they're struggling with something, but they would rather keep it to themselves or try to figure it out on their own. And this always leads to an increase in psychiatric symptoms. In my own story, I went very quickly from feeling okay to feeling not okay to then experiencing anxiety, depression, and thoughts of suicide within half a year. And within a year, I didn't want to be around anymore because I had a reduced sense of hope and self-esteem. And this stigma effect feeds itself in a cyclical nature over and over again. And I love questions coming in. I've been instructed to ask everyone to save them until the end, and then I will either answer them on this call, or I'm happy to answer them via email as well. Via email, text, however you want to correspond. Now, I will tell you that I can look back on my experience and I realized something, and I talked to young adults about this. I thought that my brain health equaled brain illness, right? And this might be a good sort of area to zone in on when you're talking to your kids. I thought brain health equaled brain illness. Either you were mentally well or you were mentally ill. If you were mentally well, your life was good to go, right? Your brain sort of ran on autopilot. You never really had to think about your brain. You never had to think about the substances you put in your brain, what you put your brain through. Your emotions were just even keel, right? Almost like that strong stoic type. But if you were mentally ill, this meant that something was seriously wrong with you, right? And my belief system at that time was that you weren't somebody that would necessarily be able to hold down a job, that you were going to live at home with your parents for the rest of your life. And so you can imagine the conflict I felt and how much fear I felt even going to the therapist, because I was afraid of the diagnosis I was going to receive. And then how defeated I was after being told that I had a chronic brain disorder, largely because I just didn't know what the rest of my life was going to look like. I feel like the hardest part was addressing it initially. And what I've learned now in my advocacy work is that I was thinking about brain health through a really narrow lens, where, of course, brain disorders are a part of the brain health continuum, but in reality, it's something that we fluctuate back and forth on based on different factors in our lives, like our genetics, like the daily stresses of life, and these significant events that we all go through. And so when you're talking to your child and working with them to build out a brain health centric culture, that of course includes therapy. I'm seeing some messages coming in, and I think that's extremely important. And we're going to touch on that here in a bit in the workshop. I also think it's really important to build awareness around the factors that are going to impact their brain over the course of their lives. So up top, we've got the 5 factors that will impact where somebody sits on the brain health continuum. And then down below, we have the brain health continuum itself, where on one side, you're living a balanced life, and on the other side, you're not able to balance. When you think about living a balanced life and maybe what you would say to your kids, what comes to mind? I'd love to hear maybe a few examples, if there are any. Of course, there's never any pressure to share. But for me, when I think about living a balanced life, it's sort of broken down into 3 pillars. The first one is feeling in control of your emotions. Absolutely, Kara. Eat well, sleep well, socialize, regulate your sleep. These are all so important. And those are some aspects that we'll talk about here in a little bit. But yeah, when we're living a balanced life, we're in control of our emotions. Yeah, Chrissy said vent. Share how you're feeling with a trusted friend, adult. 100%. Foundational aspects that are actually they feel common sense, but not always common practice, and super important for that messaging in the household, which again, we'll talk about a little bit more, but I love these examples. And when we think about living a balanced life, it's when an individual, your child, feels in control of their emotions, in control of their cognitive functioning, and feels like they can foster healthy relationships. And so for me, at one point in time, I felt like I was not able to balance, that I was not in control of my emotions. No matter what I did, I couldn't improve how I felt. I felt like because of my anxiety and depression, my cognitions were impaired. And at one point in time, I felt like I was really holding on to my relationships by a thread. Now, looking back on that situation, I understand that there were many factors at play impacting my brain health, not just the diagnosis of a brain disorder. And when I talk to the kids, I always talk about everyday challenges, primarily stress and lack of sleep. Now, you all might be seeing this as parents, but when I travel the country and poll students on how many hours of sleep they tend to get a night, they normally are telling me they get between 4 to 6, when the recommended amount of sleep is between 8 to 10. So I think that just off that statistic alone, we are seeing a huge increase in anxiety and depression because young adults are not practicing healthy coping strategies with sleep as one of those core foundational practices. And this, of course, feeds into sleep. So they released a study, a group of scientists released a study, and what they found is that individuals with above average levels of cortisol in the body tend to get lower amounts of sleep, somewhere between 4 to 6 hours a night, and have a much larger tendency towards fatigue, exhaustion, burnout, anxiety, depression, and if left untreated for long enough, thoughts of suicide. On the other side of that, individuals with below average levels or average levels of cortisol in the body, manageable levels, they found tend to get between 8 to 10 hours of sleep a night. And they, of course, showed lower levels of stress, overwhelm, anxiety, fatigue, depression, and thoughts of suicide. So that alone is something that I think is really, really important to talk about with our children and incorporate, because sleep is just something that we simply cannot skimp on. It is so important. Environmentally, I think from a cultural standpoint, for this workshop, I think it's really important to think about the culture that we're cultivating inside of the household. You know, is brain health something that's openly discussed? Do you feel comfortable openly talking about your brain health with your child, or is it something that you keep siloed off to the side and it's not really commonplace to have those discussions? Not good or bad, just good to become aware of that. And then significant events, death, divorce, breakups, major illness, and job loss. Those are all going to fluctuate where we sit on the brain health continuum. And every school I go to, I always ask the students to stand up if they've experienced one of these in the last 12 months, and almost all of them stand up, meaning that they've experienced one of these significant events. And the question I think I want to pose is, how do we approach these challenges as a household? Is this something that we tackle head on, that we look at as important and as a part of the healing process, or do we try to do it ourselves and just sort of shoulder through? I think that that messaging inside of the household is really important. And whether it's you or one of your children that's in that place right now, I think it's important to honor that can cause you to shift on the continuum, and it's important to address it. And then, of course, we have the brain health disorders and developmental disabilities. This is the genetic side of the house. We talk about diabetes, we talk about heart disease, we talk about cancer running in our households, but do we openly talk about depression or anxiety or bipolar or OCD or schizophrenia or eating disorders or any of the other brain health ailments? And had we done that in my household, I would have known first and foremost that there was about a 25 to 40% chance of inheriting OCD-like genes, and that my grandfather had untreated OCD that significantly impacted his life. And had I had that education, I would have been much more prepared. So do we talk openly about our brain health in the household, and talk about the various forms of education and how to cope and treat those ailments? But using me as a guinea pig, if brain health was fixed, right, mentally well or mentally ill, you would think that I would simply be on the not able to balance side. And that just hasn't been my reality. At one point in time, I was not able to balance, not in control of my emotions, didn't maintain sound cognitive functioning, felt disconnected from my friends and family. But once I started talk therapy specific to OCD and then started to change my lifestyle to meet my brain where it was at, I started to shift to the other side of the brain health continuum, where now I fluctuate between living a balanced life and needing help to balance. And I'm not ashamed of that, because I understand, and I always say this to the students, I understand that a poor night's sleep can fluctuate where I sit on the brain health continuum, and it doesn't define me as a person. It just reminds me that I always need to be tapping into my tool belt to take care of my brain and get the most out of every single day, which I'm sure as parents, you want that for your kids as well. And so some of these might not be earth-shattering observations, but being in the space now for 5 years, thank you, Stephanie, I appreciate that. Having been in this space for over 5 years, having spoke to tens of thousands of students at this point, these are the challenges that your child is probably facing. You might be aware of these at this point. All of these, I think, are relevant and important. The top 5 are what I see coming up time and again. The first being unhealthy lifestyle habits, predominantly in the sleep department, the diet department, and the physical fitness department. So when you're thinking about building out that brain health centric culture with your children, and you're starting to have these conversations about taking care of the body and the brain, I think it's really important to think about all of the factors that can impact the brain. Because for me, when I was initially diagnosed with OCD, they were just treating the symptoms for OCD. And while that certainly was helpful, I think what I missed out on was the broader framework, the broader picture, that there were so many other aspects and so many other factors in my life that impacted how I felt on a daily basis. And I think that this is impacting our youth at scale. So of course, addressing unhealthy lifestyle habits, I see the pressure to have it all figured out being one of the biggest factors amongst high schoolers today. And I think that this is because they have access to other people's lives at scale, and they're falling victim to comparison. And so I have a whole chapter of my book dedicated to creating a healthy relationship with social media so that they can begin to reframe what social media can be used for in a positive way, and ideally reduce some of those feelings of pressure, because I think that that is leading to burnout and anxiety and stress and overwhelm and depression. And I just had a conversation with a high schooler the other day, and he just feels completely defeated because he doesn't know what he wants to do for the rest of his life, and it all stems from comparison. And then lastly, feelings of loneliness or disconnection. When I was doing research for my book, what they found, Stigma released a report, and what they found is that Gen Zs and millennials are the 2 loneliest generations alive today. And that when they polled this large group of millennials and Gen Zs, that the average came out to half a person, that they felt connected, deeply connected to half of a person, right? About 0.5% of somebody that they felt that they could actually speak to and be their truest self. And so when we're thinking about and tackling brain health, we want to think about all the different factors that could be impacting them. And absolutely, I got a message about, them feeling feelings of anger all the time, which could be stemming from multiple different areas, multiple different factors, which is why I love to bring that up. And I will absolutely be answering questions at the end. Some of these I'm like so tempted to answer now because I have a thought on what just came through, but for the sake of time, I'm going to save it for the end. I'm also happy to answer them after the workshop. So this is where I want the parents to know that wherever your son or daughter is at right now, it's okay. It's okay for them to not be okay right now. And I don't mean that in a fluffy wall art sense. I actually mean it from more of a neuroscience-based approach. And when I really started to dive into the neuroscience of the brain and why we feel what we feel, it became really evident to me. And the best way that I can explain this is that all of our emotions are just signalers. And they're signaling, getting readings from our environment externally and internally, and trying to get our attention. We don't really judge when we feel hungry or thirsty. Of course, this is our bodies trying to get our attention to say, hey, drink some more water. You're thirsty. This is what's going to restore balance inside of our bodies. But when it comes to emotions, right? Cognitions. Sometimes we don't always look at them that way. And certainly for teens and young adults, they can be ashamed by what they feel. And yet emotions are just signalers. And the best way I can say this is, we don't shun happiness and joy. And yet happiness is an emotion that we feel. And it's our brain's way of saying, hey, whatever is going on in your external environment or internally, give me more of that. That feels good. Stress, on the opposite side of that, I think is the most ignored emotion on the face of the planet, because stress is sort of that first signaler that the brain is trying to give the brain and body that something externally or internally is out of balance. And that's why we want to know about all of the different factors and know about all of the different treatment modalities for ourselves and our children, so that we can start to pay attention to these emotions. And I think that at my darkest moments, when I was having thoughts of suicide, my brain was screaming at me to try to get my attention that something was out of balance in my life. In this particular case, some of it was genetically based and some of it was externally based. And I was able to learn that through the process, and through that process was able to get better outcomes. So I always say it's okay to not be okay. It's just not okay to do nothing about it. And I get a sense that this group is bought in on that this group believes in seeking help. There's more questions coming in. I'm so tempted to answer them. And exactly, Chris said, when you're hungry, you eat. And that should be the same with our emotions. When we feel stress, rather than pushing through, we should pause and say, why am I feeling stressed right now? If we're feeling anxious, pausing and say, why are we feeling anxious right now? So really important to start to instill these simple, basic practices with our children as well. Things I wish I would have known. Because at the start of my journey, when I was feeling anxious, I wish I would have paused to say, well, why am I feeling anxious? Versus rejecting the emotion and attempting to suppress it. And of course, this example really hits with teens and young adults. So if you're a parent and you're trying to get your child bought in on this concept, here's your example, right? And I always tell them, we know this with our physical health. And I tell them that when I was at the rec center at Purdue, I was playing basketball, and I remember I went up to block this guy's shot. And when I came down, my foot landed on his, and I felt my ankle bone touch the floor. Boom! Immediately, pain shot from my ankle to my brain, signaling that something externally or internally was out of balance. It needed to get my attention because there was something that I needed to do about it. So of course, what did I do? I went to the wellness center on Purdue's campus. I met with a doctor. I got an x-ray. I got a diagnosis, and then I was put on a recovery plan. And when I explain this to the youth, it makes sense to them, right? We know this intuitively. Anytime we're struggling with something, physical, an illness or an injury, we seek professional assistance, we get a diagnosis, and we get put on a recovery plan. But when it comes to the brain, oftentimes as children, we don't think about it this way. We don't think about stress, anxiety, depression as a signaler letting us know that something's out of balance. And we should just follow the same process, that we seek professional assistance, we get a diagnosis, and we get put on a recovery plan. And when we stand the two up next to each other, we realize that the stigma is the only difference between our physical health and our brain health. And if we were able to remove that stigma from the youth, right? Just get this sort of information in front of them as early as possible. They would start to look at brain health as health, where our physical and our brain health are on an equal playing field. And regardless of whether it's a physical injury or illness or something with the brain, we go seek professional assistance, we get a diagnosis, and we get put on a recovery plan. And I love the comments coming in. I'm trying to read them as much as I can, but I think that this is so beneficial for others to read as well. But I will tell you, one thing I've learned, especially speaking to teenagers and young adults, is that I think sometimes it's difficult for them to understand what they're feeling. And I want to talk a little bit with you all about depression, anxiety, and suicide. So depression is sadness that lingers, intensifies, and persists for a 2-week time period or longer. So I always say that we all feel sadness, but typically that sadness tends to go away. When it doesn't, though, is when we can start to look out for those warning signs of depression. And as parents, we definitely want to be proactive in talking about depression, anxiety, and suicide in the household and talk about what those symptoms are. Absolutely, Sonia. And that is a big part of this workshop and a big part of why I wrote the book, because part of it is the psychology of getting people over the hump to see therapy and see talking about what they're struggling with as a valuable resource. And absolutely, my book is a great way to help normalize this conversation. I also have a podcast as well that you might be interested in. I think from a behavior standpoint, for any of those parents that don't already know about the signs and symptoms, again, I don't want to assume that this is all brand new information. For some of you, it's going to be a refresher. For others, it's more on the newer side. From a behavior standpoint, I think looking out for withdrawal from others and neglect of responsibilities are two of the big ones that we want to look out for, and not assume that our son or daughter is just being lazy or that they're in a funk and they'll get over it in time or they'll grow out of it. Because what I've found is a lot of times when I work with clients one-on-one, the parents will come to me after a few years of their son or daughter struggling. They didn't grow out of it. That's because that doesn't really happen with depression and anxiety. There actually has to be intentional action there. And then, of course, we have anxiety. Of course, we all have anxiety. We all have that fight, flight, or freeze system inside of our brain, which stems from the amygdala, which is an almond-shaped part of the brain inside of the limbic system. So we all experience anxiety, but I think it's really important for teens and young adults to know, yeah, absolutely. Sometimes those who suffer are great actors. It's so true. And that's why we want to normalize conversation in the household. We want to transcend past acting. I was also a great actor. Nobody knew. I could have taken it to the grave with me, but I didn't feel safe talking about it. And that's why I'm out talking about this. I think it's really important. And Paul, I really appreciate that. So anxiety can kind of hide in different forms. It can show up as stomach pain. It can show up as chest pain. It can show up as headaches and sweating, tingling, or numbness. For me, I was taking Prilosec OTC for 2 years because of stomach pain. The moment I addressed my anxiety and started to treat the anxiety symptoms, the stomach pain completely went away. I also hear this with other individuals around chest pain. So anxiety can sort of be a bundled package where you get a lot of different symptoms. But excessive worry, feeling on edge, your child isolating themselves are all signs and symptoms that they might be struggling with anxiety. And then, of course, signs that your child is suicidal. I put this picture up deliberately of a smiling young man because I think, to Paula's point, some of us are great actors. Me too. I was smiling to my friends on my darkest night, the night that I considered taking my life. Yes, Kristen, chronic dizziness is also a symptom. And I used to really struggle with dizziness and didn't realize at first that it came from my anxiety. So that is an excellent point. And I think the big thing as an advocate that I want to talk about with all the parents, with all of you today, is that it is so important that our kid could be the shining example of a student. They're in all the clubs. They've got the best grades. They've got the most friends. They come home with a smile on their face. They feel engaged in life. And so we don't talk about mental health in the household because we sort of think about mental health in one way, right? Mentally well or mentally ill. That's okay. I was the same way. But I was also that smiley kid involved in all the clubs, had good grades and a lot of friends. And it happened to me and I tried to hide it from my parents. So what I always advocate for is proactively having these conversations, laying down the culture in the house that, hey, we actively talk about brain health because it's normal. We all have brains. Our brains matter. They're the most important organ in the body. And we always want to do everything that we can to take care of them. Having thoughts of suicide is not a weakness. It's a signal. And because of that signal, we want to listen to it and figure out what the answer is, what it needs so that the brain starts to feel better. And so what I'll debunk today is that talking about suicide plants a seed in the head of the person who's struggling. That's simply not true from my own personal experience and then all of the research out there. If somebody's struggling with thoughts of suicide, they've gotten there on their own and they're actually just praying, just like I was, for a safe space to talk about it without feeling like a burden to others. And so we want to proactively have these conversations. That can start with just simply sitting down to a dinner one night and saying, hey, do you all talk about mental health at school? Do any of your friends ever talk about their mental health? Have you all ever discussed suicide at school? Have you ever struggled with suicidal thoughts out of curiosity? Making it very casual just to start those conversations. And I'm seeing some direct messages coming in, and just know that I'm here for support, and I really want to connect with all of you after the program. So what are the real world signs? And I was talking to my wife about this before. For some of these, they're not going to be light bulb moments for you. For others, it might be. But the big thing that I want everyone to take away from this slide is every single time I see the pattern being the same, where when a student is really starting to be impact with anxiety, depression, stress, burnout, academics are the first thing to go. And I can tell you, the first thing that went for me was my performance at work, because it was just exhausting to exist. And so what I would encourage everybody to think about is not taking poor academic performance at face value by asking a different set of questions. So I think in the past, I would have maybe assumed that somebody doing poor academically didn't enjoy their classes, or maybe their classes were too difficult, or maybe they needed a mentor. But now as an advocate, I really start to ask myself a different set of questions. What is this person potentially going through? Why are they not getting good grades, right? Rather than just immediately jumping in to try to solve the problem, what could they potentially be struggling with? So just starting to think a little bit differently about why our children might be experiencing withdrawal from friends at school, or a declined interest in activities they once enjoyed. And I'm seeing, perfectionism is another disorder not to be overlooked. Absolutely, Sonia. And I actually had somebody who specialized in perfectionism on my podcast. So if that's an episode that you all are interested in, please check that out. It's the You're Not Alone podcast. It's on all podcasting platforms. So this is where I want all the parents to know that this too shall pass. I get phone calls a lot of the time from parents or students that are in that dark place, right? They're deeply depressed. They're severely anxious. They're struggling with thoughts of suicide. They're burnt out. And I always tell my clients that you're looking at your life through the lens of how you feel right now. And I can attest to that. I know how difficult it was to think about my life through a brighter lens when all I had was negative, depressed, and anxious thoughts running through my brain 24/7. I couldn't feel hope. I couldn't sense what a brighter day would potentially look like. And yet what I learned through that process is that this too shall pass. It does pass, but you have to ask. And nothing is permanent. Nothing lasts forever. And so if you're in that place right now, maybe you're getting ready to start that journey with your child. Maybe you've already been in it. I just want you to know that there is hope for a brighter day. And I'm testament to that. And I just want to keep the energy positive and let you know that there is hope for a brighter day, and to keep pushing forward. And so lastly, as we conclude today's workshop, I want to just take about the next 10 minutes to talk about setting up a brain health centric culture inside of the household. Now, I think that this is one of the most important things that we can do, is starting to create safe spaces, starting to normalize talking about the brain in the house. My wife and I literally talk about our brains every day. It's so common that I forget that in a lot of cases it's uncommon. So when I'm talking to organizations and institutions, this is the same process that I follow, and I want this to be normalized in families across the country. And when we think about setting up a brain health centric culture in the household, it's really broken down into 3 core areas. And I would suggest that you write these down if you don't feel that your house is sort of already comfortable with these discussions. So number 1, we want to normalize brain health. Number 2, we want to demonstrate healthy coping strategies. And number 3, we want to emphasize help-seeking behavior. So when we think about normalizing brain health inside of the household and talking to teens and young adults, it gets back to the earlier part of this workshop, where we first examine our belief systems towards the brain, right? Do we think about mental health or brain health as binary, right? As either or mentally well and or mentally ill? Or do we see it as more of a continuum that has a lot of different factors that impact where we sit on the continuum? So I think that that's step number one. And then talking about that continuum with our children, and then talking about the various factors. What are the different real world factors? Thinking back to that slide that I pulled up, lifestyle, bullying, disconnection from friends. What are all of the various factors that could impact your child's brain health, and help them build that awareness so that they can be regulators of their own emotional well-being in today and into the future. So that's number one, right? We normalize brain health by talking about the brain. Next, we demonstrate healthy coping strategies. I can tell that there are a lot of parents on here that are bought in on brain health. They want to take care of their brain. They're probably taking care of their brains, but are we articulating that in the household? So like the perfect example being physical fitness. I think in the past, most people worked out for their bodies, but can we start to articulate that working out is both good for your body and your brain, and it's a really healthy coping strategy outside of drinking, smoking pot, and vaping, the three most common substances I see being abused amongst high schoolers and college students, as a way to get the most out of their lives. So really demonstrating, talking about coping strategies outside of alcohol, cannabis, and nicotine, which are the three most common I see being used. Yes, offering lifestyle change suggestions often gets a shrug and an immediate that won't work. Doesn't mean we don't stop. But yes, Paula, I totally agree. It's one of those things where we want to just continue to gently massage that messaging in over time. And then lastly, emphasize help-seeking behavior. Everybody on this call, well, I would assume more than likely, most of us have a family doctor on this call. Most of us have a dentist that we see on a biannual to annual basis. But how many of us have a family therapist or psychologist that we see, at a bare minimum biannually or annually, just to get a brain health checkup, the same way that we do for our bodies and our teeth. So just starting to demonstrate that brain health is health, that it's an important aspect of just taking care of our overall well-being. And Sonia, I agree. Best to ask the child what they think would be helpful rather than tell them. And that is exactly the next slide. So that is perfect timing. So the keys to proper communication. Sonia sort of hit the nail on the head with this one. But when we're starting to create a brain health centric culture in the household, it's really, really critical to essentially ask questions in a non-judgmental, accepting environment, and then sit back and listen. So in my advocacy work and in my coaching practice, I talk at about it's about an 80-20 split, where the young adult or the teen talks about 80% of the time, and I speak about 20% of the time. But the majority of the time that I'm speaking is spent asking questions. And I think it's a really valid point, what Sonia brought up, that oftentimes teens and young adults, they just want to come to the answer on their own. And through curiosity, asking questions that seek to understand, that maybe slowly start to drive them towards that result, can oftentimes sort of set off that light bulb moment for them. You wanted to give them that advice, but they were able to get there on their own just by them feeling like they were listened to. And actually, that is the biggest piece of feedback that I receive from teens and young adults when I speak, is that oftentimes they don't feel listened to by their parents. And the ones that do are oftentimes the ones that I feel have the closest relationships with their parents and are comfortable talking about stress, burnout, anxiety, depression, etc., as well as healthy coping strategies. So I think that was a really important point, Sonia, that you brought up. Important to reflect back to ensure understanding and ask how you can help. And in my wife and I's household, two very simple questions and a phrase, I guess you could say, that we use is, what would be helpful for you right now, right? What would be helpful? How would you like to be supported right now? What would be helpful for you to receive from me right now? Because it takes it off of you just being the advice giver. And to Sonia's point, it goes back to trying to seek understanding and ask how you can support. And then another phrase that I use time and again in my advocacy and in our household is just tell me more about that. Rather than assuming, tell me more about that. So just a couple simple phrases that you can utilize to start those conversations. And then, of course, we always want to ask for professional help. I see that somebody put psychologytoday.com into the chat. I was going to share some resources on a slide coming up here in a second, but that is a great resource. That is the resource that I used when I was in my dark place. And so I think that that is a great resource to share. The big thing that I'll shout out for asking for professional help is that therapists are not a jack of all trades. I did not know this at the beginning of my journey. I figured a psychologist and a psychiatrist and a therapist and a counselor, they're all the same, right? They treat the brain and that's it. And what I learned through my journey is that this simply isn't true. In fact, psychologists and psychiatrists alike, counselors, therapists, etc., they treat different brain health ailments and they specialize in different talk therapies. And they really should. If you meet a therapist that says that they're a jack of all trades, that actually is a sign that they're probably not a good fit. You want them to specialize in something the same way that a cardiologist specializes in treating the heart. And of course, I had to learn this the hard way. I spent about a year finding the right therapist, and it wasn't until I found one that specialized in treating OCD that I actually began to improve. So if you are sending your child to therapy, it's not enough to just sort of check the box. They're going to therapy. They should be good. We do want to start to track their improvement. And if they're not showing signs of improvement within the first 2 months, that's probably a sign that either things have grown stale with that individual or they're not getting the right type of treatment. And we want to be open to exploring multiple options. So I think that that's really important to point out. And then, of course, this list is not exhaustive by any means, but I did want to provide some basic talk therapy options that you can explore with your child as you start to go on that journey with them. I always get asked about medication. And what I will tell you is that I think medication is absolutely a part of the journey, and it's something that you should explore with you and your child if you think it could be beneficial. But talk therapy should be non-negotiable. So if your child is struggling with burnout, stress, anxiety, depression, thoughts of suicide, medication is completely fine, but there also needs to be talk therapy involved. And that's because the science and the studies there's so many of them now that have come out that basically stood up talk therapy next to medication. And what they've found time and again is that talk therapy is just as effective, if not more effective, as medication over the long term. And when I work with clients one-on-one, I always think about, I try to think about brain health through the long term. What are some tools that I can implement for long-term assistance? Yeah, totally, Sarah, totally. And I'm not gonna, that is the one thing as an advocate that's a little more difficult to help. And that's a lot of times why I'll get called in to help families out, because it is difficult to get appointments. It is more difficult to get appointments with a brain health professional, but there are a lot of different ways that you can tackle a teen or a young adult's mental health while you're waiting to see a brain health professional. And I think that my book definitely touches on a lot of that, and I'm happy to have some of those conversations after the workshop. For the sake of time, I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I'm not going to get into detail. These are some of the more popular predominant talk therapies out there. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is sort of considered the golden standard of talk therapies. It's used to treat anxiety and depression, and it's very effective. Exposure and response prevention, or ERP, is what's used to treat OCD specifically, and it is the #1 scientifically proven way to treat OCD. So if you, a son or a daughter, was diagnosed with OCD and you're not doing ERP, let's connect afterwards, because I want to talk you through that process. And I think it'd be really important to get you on that path. And then lastly, these are more of the lifestyle factors. These are the behaviors that I would love, if they're not already being talked about in the household, that we really start to drill these home with our kids. And again, Sonia sort of touched on this, but there's a more roundabout way to start to infuse this into the culture of the household, where we really start to put sleep, meditation, exercise at the forefront of everything that we do. And especially with our kids, because I think what I learned after my diagnosis is, yes, I was struggling with OCD. That was a genetic side of the house, but I was also neglecting my sleep. I didn't have healthy coping strategies. I was leaning heavily on substances like pot to reduce my levels of stress, and I wasn't using healthy, long-term, sustainable strategies. So the big ones that I'll point out are sleep, meditation, and exercise for the sake of today. I'm sure every parent here on the call knows, but it's important. It's a good refresher to talk to your children about getting enough sleep. Like I said, about the average amount is between 4 to 6 hours a night from teens and young adults, and yet their recommended amount is between 8 to 10. And if they just improve this one aspect of their life, they would be able to significantly reduce stress, burnout, their feelings of anxiety and depression. Not saying that sleep is going to cure, for example, OCD or bipolar or generalized anxiety, but it does help. On days when I don't get enough sleep, I feel a significant uptick in my anxiety and depression levels. And then, of course, we have meditation. Regardless of what your belief system is towards meditation, I believe that it's exercise for the brain. And what I mean by this is that there are so many studies that have come out now that have found that when we meditate for no more than 10 minutes a day, we shrink a region in the brain that's responsible for anxiety. It's that amygdala, that almond-shaped part of the brain that we were talking about earlier. And just through 10 minutes, we shrink that region, creating a calmer mind. And the best part is you don't have to be an expert or meditate for long periods of time. You can download an app like Headspace, My Life, or Calm to start to reap those benefits. Now I'm seeing, I don't want to pop ahead too fast, but I am seeing that maybe some people are jumping off. I do want to make sure that everybody is able to connect with me. For the sake of time, I'm going to move forward. These are the apps that I use to measure and track my sleep. And anytime I work with a client one-on-one, these are the apps that I have them use. Auto Sleep, which is connected to my Apple Watch, tracks my sleep every single day. So it starts to build that accountability and excitement around getting enough sleep, which is so important for the brain. And then, of course, the middle one is Headspace, or how many minutes I've meditated. And besides talk therapy, I always tell the students that meditation is the single most important thing that I've implemented in my life. So here are some external resources that you can utilize. Obviously, someone put psychologytoday.com in the chat. There are virtual options like Talkspace and BetterHelp. There are more niche options for those looking to talk to somebody and call it the LGBTQ community or the Black American community, whatever it might be. So just wanted to provide some resources there. If you want to start to introduce that brain health centric culture into your household, my podcast is a great place to do that. Every single week, I release an episode with somebody who is either has a lived experience or is an expert in the space of brain health, right? So we talk about all sorts of different topics: OCD, schizophrenia, treating depression, anxiety. I've brought on a mindfulness and meditation expert to teach healthy coping mechanisms. So there's all sorts of different options. I brought on somebody for perfectionism. So all sorts of different options to get young adults started on their path. Of course, you can find my book by searching You're Not Alone on Amazon. So you can find that there. I'm not going to go on and on about this, but I do provide mental health coaching, one-on-one coaching with clients. If anytime you work with me, my goal is to also have that young adult or that teen working with a therapist in conjunction with me, so that we're tackling whatever challenges they're experiencing from multiple angles. Because like I discovered in my journey, there are so many factors that impact the brain, and we want to tackle things from a holistic standpoint. If you do want to stay in touch, you can do one of two things. You can follow me on Instagram at Zach_Westerbeck, or you can take out your phone and you can take a picture of this QR code right now, and a little screen will pop up, and it's just going to ask for your email, your first and last name, You can throw in your phone number if you want. And I think you check the box on whether you're interested in talking about the coaching services or the book or anything else. So you can take a look at that, and I'd be happy to connect. You can also go to my website, zachwesterbeck.com, and you can send me an email directly that way too. So I'll let that sit there for a second. And thank you for all of the kind messages. I really appreciate it. That's Kimberly. That's the modern approach to the brain. So that is beautiful. I love to see that. Man, I wish I could read all these comments. So to conclude today's workshop, I wanna leave everybody on a high note. Sometimes when your child is in a dark place, it feels like they've been buried alive, but perhaps they've just been planted, and now is their opportunity to bloom. I'm so grateful for all of you. Just remember that this too shall pass, whatever they're going through, and the next best version is on the other side for them. We just need to seek the help. And I will open it up for questions. Thank you for the kind words. Thank you.
Yay,
really appreciate it.
Zach. We can't thank you enough. And man, that last slide was powerful, very powerful. I love that. Yeah, good stuff. We do have lots of questions. However, I know that it's already 4:05 and this was to conclude at 4. I want to be sensitive to everybody's time, but not sure, Zach, if you want to take a few questions now or if you would rather us get with you at a later time.
I'm happy to answer some questions.
Okay. Well, let's ask a couple here. Somebody asked about, is your book appropriate for older graduates, perhaps 31-year-olds?
So I try to niche it down as much as possible, but I have been told there are people that have read my book all the way up into their 70s and said that it's been beneficial for them. So
Great.
There are many different books out there, many different resources, but yes, I think that there are some takeaways that a 31-year-old could find from the book.
Absolutely. And I'm getting a lot of questions about enforcing sleep discipline without creating more anxiety. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So there's a great book out there called Atomic Habits. And I think in conjunction with my book, I think the big idea with sleep is forming a sleep ritual. That's something that I do religiously. My wife and I both follow a very similar pattern that starts in the evening time, that starts to activate and basically tell our brains that we're starting that wind down process. And it's through habit formulation and habit stacking, which James Clear, who's one of my favorite authors, talks about in his book, Atomic Habits.
Fabulous. All right, so we have another question about son was diagnosed with ADHD and high anxiety and now is exhibiting some OCD symptoms. Any thoughts on how to address that?
So the first thing is to understand that there's, they call it comorbidities, but essentially there's a direct link between anxiety and ADHD and anxiety and the likelihood that somebody experiences the onset of OCD. So the very first one out of all of those that I would recommend tackling is the OCD. So if you believe that, I think you said son, so if you believe your son has OCD, the very first thing you want to do is you want to set up an appointment, and you can either use psychologytoday.com or you can use a platform that I partner with pretty closely. It's called NoCD, which is, I'll type it in the chat. Hopefully I'm going to make sure I'm sending this to everybody. NoCD.com. Oh, come on. NoCD.com is a great resource where you can set up an appointment for your child. They can jump on and they'll go through an assessment to confirm whether or not they have OCD. And if they do have OCD, what's great is it's a virtual platform. So he can set up appointments from the comfort of his room, from the comfort of his laptop, and begin to work on ERP. And I saw somebody put a question is, what is ERP? ERP is an acronym that stands for Exposure and Response Prevention. And it is the #1 scientifically proven talk therapy for OCD. It's the most effective. So while there are other treatments and talk therapies that can be helpful, ERP is the most effective. And through treating the OCD, my belief is that, in my experience and what I've seen with others, is that his anxiety will improve, because if he does have OCD, he's struggling with intrusive thoughts. And those intrusive thoughts, it's called being ego dystonic, but basically they're not in alignment with his values and morals. And that's causing him to experience anxiety. And as sort of like an ancillary second effect, that anxiety, which makes it very, very difficult to focus, can feed into things like ADHD. So I know that there was a lot there, but the big thing is look into treating the OCD first, confirm on a diagnosis, use a website like nocd.com, which I'm putting in the chat again, as a great place to start, or you can use psychologytoday.com.
Zach, we could go on and on for hours. I know we could. We've got lots more questions, but I know that you've left your contact information and folks can reach out to you. And we just appreciate your time and being with us today. This was obviously a topic that needs to be talked about more often. So thank you for your gift, and thank you for sharing that with us today. We appreciate you and are proud that you're a Purdue alumni. Thanks everyone for joining. Yes,
I'm proud too.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. And reach out to me. I will be happy to talk to you. So
fabulous.
We can go from there.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks everyone for joining. We'll see you next time.